Hey guys, this is Meeker here. I'm doing a mock roster part 2 to PTR. This is after some additional updates, but the base idea behind these rosters is SNS is overtuned next patch, and Void Gauntlet looks overtuned next patch, and Fire Staff looks pretty overtuned next patch, so you're trying to figure out how to slot as many of those builds as possible that are viable, as well as figure out ways to reduce the amount of Great Axe Warhammers that you have, because Warhammer is no longer a good weapon. Great Axe is still a good weapon and helps enable the rest of your army, but the main goal is to figure out a replacement to that weapon, and I think SNS is a good start. That being said, I think that Warhammer is still needed because of the CC that it provides on point and just the disruption that it provides in general in a tight space. I think still makes it good enough to warrant being run. I think that will slowly transition to being less and less Warhammers, but that being said, let's hop right into it. Talking about the point, this shouldn't seem like a lot of surprises. The only thing that is kind of more different than the live patch, I think, is SNS Spear. SNS VG, I still think, is the generally best SNS variant that you can run. The problem with SNS IG is when you run out of stam, then you're going to go to IG, and you don't really do that much with IG. Like, you can entomb, you can drop shower, maybe drop your pylon, but you don't really have that much to do, and IG in general just doesn't seem super impactful. And you're already super tanky, so I don't think you necessarily need the IG itself. If you're worried about people collapsing on you, Void Gauntlet still provides solutions to that, because when people collapse on you, you swap to your Void Gauntlet, you scream the clump, you drop your Obliv, and that sets up your melees to nuke the clump. So I think SNS VG is still the best default. I did throw in one SNS Spear here, because I think Spear has good disruption, especially if people are trying to get their pots off, and they're in a spot where they actually don't have grit. That's where Spear really shines. You land the sweep, and it's basically a good night. Sweep is like the equivalent of landing a javelin pretty much in terms of CC duration, is not affected by freedom, which makes it very strong in terms of killing people without grit and disrupting armies as a whole. I originally had a Spear IG and Heavy on point, but I think SNS is just too good to not run that 20% Fortify, even if you are losing out on a little bit of the ice showers. The other thing to take into consideration is when you land a fortified shield rush, or just a shield rush in general, you apply a 30% slow to basically the entire army in a choke, because it's a 5-meter radius, which is, in terms of New World, is about the biggest it gets. For conventional stuff, like clap obviously would be bigger, but for most weapons, nothing really gets bigger than 5-meter radius, so you still have that slow potential that you would have with the Ice Gauntlet. You could exist in the choke really well, and with SNS Spear, you basically never run out of stam, because once your stam is broke, you go to Spear, you Cyclone, then you have your full stam back, and you just get back right into it. With SNS VG, you will run out of stam, but swapping to a VG is never really a bad thing, because Void Gauntlet looks really strong next patch with the old Ren that it applies, and SNS seems really strong with the old Fortify that it gives. I don't think Great Axe SNS is something you consider for a point build after testing. I think it's something you consider in a ball setup, but SNS Spear I could consider to be good in a point build. Great Axe Warhammer, I still think you run those on point, particularly in heavy. Before people were running them in medium to a degree. I don't really see a reason to run them in medium anymore. All you want is like the max CC duration, and you get more freedom anyway by running in heavy, and I don't think you really give up much. In terms of Void stuff that you want on point, I think Void Blade makes a lot of sense, because you have the grit now, you apply Weakened, you apply Old Rend, you give your entire team Oblivion buff. It seems really good overall. I would run Blade, Scream, and Oblivion for on point, but off point I would consider dropping the Oblivion for Orb. I would still run 2 group healers on point. There is an argument to drop some of those, and I don't think it's like a bad idea, but with a Void Blade and with a Great Axe Warhammer that are probably going to be really aggro, I think it makes a lot of sense just to keep your group alive in that choke. The main purpose of the point team is just to disrupt in that general point area, not necessarily win, but kind of create a stalemate, make it so that the space is contested and the rest of your ball kind of does the rest of the work. If you have a normal ball group in here, people won't be able to play as aggro, which is why I think double healer group is still the way to go, as well as it kind of helps with with the new changes to with less fortify helps people alive. I don't think it makes sense to slot an AoE healer simply because orbit protection doesn't do enough. Since orbit protection, even heavy, best case scenario is worth about a 3% fortify, which in general is just not worth it. So I think it makes more sense just to slot a group healer and rely on Divine's Embrace to give stam back and the other heals to really keep people alive. The Divine Embrace versus Light's Embrace, I think, is kind of debatable. The one that gives you stam, I think, is generally really good with SNS to have one of those, but the other one is also really good because when people are below half HP, which is really often for an SNS, you can kind of turn it into a pseudo AoE heal, which is really nice. In terms of ball groups, I have one ball group on B, and then the rest I say would go to A and C. The ball group on B, I think, has a little bit of a different setup. I think you want a Great Axe Warhammer just for the grouping potential. A Spear is just nice for that extra CC. A Void Blade without the Obliv, and then a VGIG with the Obliv. I think you need both kinds of Void Gauntlets next patch, and I don't think you could really have too many Void Gauntlets because it still provides a lot in terms of the Scream util. The Orb is really good because it's Old Rend. Oblivion is really good. Void Blade is really good. There's not the fact that they've removed that one passive, so then maybe you can get away with running more now. But I think in general, Void Gauntlet is the strongest class in the game. Next patch, and SNS is probably the second strongest class in the game, and then after that is Fire Staff. In terms of your other ball groups, I think you want really a lot to try the Great Axe SNS. If you have played it before, you'll kind of know how much disruption it really has and how tanky it really is. You can main hand the Great Axe when people collapse on you, you go back to your SNS, you land your shield rush, you land your shield bash, and then you're back to full stam, and then you can just block and you won't die in that choke. It's also a really good way to approach ranged weapons in general, because you can just block and then you aren't really taking any damage. Great Axe Warhammer I still think is not bad to have one of them. That being said, I think there could be a better build that comes to Rise to replace the Warhammer in general, but I think a Great Axe is smart to have. I think a Void Blade on the foot with the damage focused without the Obliv makes sense to run in a ball group. And I think a typical VGIG also makes sense to kind of set up the Void Blade to an extent, set up the Great Axe Warhammer to an extent, and just let people do what people want to do. In terms of the other ball group I have, I think Great Axe Warhammer makes sense. VGIG is in general, like those two are a staple to any group. Spear, I think having one of those for the weekends is nice. The Sweep is also a really, really good ability. And I have a Fire Staff Ice Gauntlet because you could try to sneak one of those into a ball group. On a live patch, a lot of people try to sneak in an IGBB into a ball group so that they can run like 4 to 5 of those, but not necessarily put them all in one group because they tend to do better in a ball group, and this is a spot where I think you could sneak in a Fire Staff. I think Fire Staff Ice Gauntlet's a little bit better than Fire Staff Blunderbuss after the changes, but both of those are good slots in that kind of role. In terms of the more specialist groups, for the Disruptor group, I think Spear Ice Gauntlet is the new Disruptor weapon. With the Hatchet changes, I don't think Great Sword is viable with Hatchet anymore, and I think is only viable with Great Axe. That being said, I think Spear Ice Gauntlet functions a little bit better as at the disruption role, and the Great Axe with Great Sword can do a little bit more damage, but that at the same time kind of struggles to stay alive in a particular area, which is why I would not say it's the best role for a Disruptor, because Disruptors generally want to basically exist in their backline, take aggro, and just kind of absorb damage. So you want a few of those people that are generally more tanky, and I think Spear is that class that is more tanky due to its inherent more dodges, and then you go to Ice Gauntlet when things get sticky, and then you just kind of kite out with that. I have a Smolder Kitten build, which I talked about a bit ago, which is basically just a glorified flamethrower that's looking to spread smolders so that your Fire Staff Ice Gauntlets can look to blow people up faster. This is a build that traditionally was slotted at times to disrupt healers a bit, and is kind of annoying because every time a healer would cast something, they would get basically max burn stacks. Even though the flamethrower did get heavily nerfed, I still think it makes sense to run 1 or 2 of these. The flamethrower nerf basically made it so that you apply smolder half as fast, and it does more damage to compensate, but it's still less damage than it was before. That being said, I still think it's a good build to run, and if it was not viable, I would just swap that for another Fire Staff Ice Gauntlet or Fire Staff Blunderbuss. I don't really think you're going to have too many Ice Gauntlets still. Ice Gauntlet, in my opinion, is the most overpowered but underrated weapon in the game because it could be used in every single class without any detriment and tends to make classes better other than healer. In terms of the kill squad groups, I think you still do a bow group. Bow spear is kind of a specialist thing that's been run a little bit on NA. The base idea is you land a javelin. Before it would be the rending javelin. I think you could still do a rending javelin, but the base important part is you're on the ground for so long that you can't actually dodge, and you basically just get blown up by the bows if that javelin hits. It's something that is inherently a little bit less tanky, but is really, really good at just setting up your group to get an easy one-shot off on someone. It's very, very strong for 3-2-1-ing people, both on defense and attack. In terms of the kind of lead in that group, the person that's trying to initiate and control space, I think SNS Great Axe makes sense. SNS, if you run the really, really strong SNS that you can farm in Brimstone, but it's named Shadow's Edge, it can do really good damage. Great Axe has really good kite and can easily disrupt people. I think that's like, in general, SNS next patch seems like a little bit stronger than Greatsword, and I don't think it makes sense to run a Greatsword necessarily in that role as a lead. I think you run this either in light or in medium. I don't think you run it in heavy or anything like that. I think that's kind of a little bit too funky. There is a shield that you can get in medium that is like super, super strong for SNS if you're looking to block, but I think you're trying to maximize your DPS and you want a shield that enables your SNS to really do a lot of damage, and then you use your Great Axe just to force cooldowns to be used, basically. In terms of the other kill squad, I think you do another flamethrower. That is a little bit variable depending if flamethrower still feels good, and then you throw in a bunch of fire staffs. Base idea here is fire staff is just inherently better than musket as of next patch. Musket does not seem like it has a spot in the meta and is not super slottable. If the musket changes got significantly better, this would be the spot where you'd maybe run 1 or 2 muskets and then you would just run 2 fire staff blunderbusses. But this being said, this kind of setup will allow you to get to 8 fire staffs, which I think is about what you want. I think you want 6 to 8 of those, and then 3 bows I still think is like a little bit on the lighter side. I think bow is inherently really strong next patch because everyone's going to be running LE aversion, not physical aversion. And then all the other classes on here just kind of take advantage of the fact that Fortify doesn't exist. Spear allows you to inherently have a lot of dodges because you could run at 150 dex, and you will just be able to get out of situations with that alone. Void Gauntlet's just the best support class in the game. Blunderbuss is no longer viable in that aspect, in my opinion. I don't think Blunderbuss in general is viable as a weapon as a whole. I think it's not bad from a fire staff perspective, but I think other than that, it doesn't make a lot of sense to run. Even with the immortal power changes, like fire staff can hold space okay, but if fire staff gets pressured by basically any class of or if blunderbuss gets pressured by basically any class, the blunderbuss is going to lose the duel in next patch, in my opinion, simply because it lacks the range DPS that it needs. If you get into a blunderbuss's phase and you don't know they have a blunderbuss, it could be good, which is why I say it could be decent with fire staff, but I don't think it's really good as a main weapon as a whole anymore. It is better as sort of an offhand, util kind of damage-based weapon. Util as in, it's kind of a back pocket thing, like, oh, you got too close to me, I'm gonna go, like, try to one-shot you. But in terms of everything else, I don't think the blunderbuss is nearly as good as it was in the current patch. So let me know what you guys think about this. There's a couple builds that I think could be on this list that I didn't put on this list, like the Spear Ice Gauntlet idea. I think some of those could be swapped out for something. I think the SNS Spear could be swapped out for something, but in general, trying to maximize the amount of SNSs, Void Gauntlets, and reduce the amount of Great Axe Warhammers that you have just because of the Rend and Fortify changes. And I'll see you guys in the next video.